I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about Jeff. You know, a lot of people, when you go into academics, you hope you can make a dent in your field. And Jeff has really blazed a path where his work is appreciated in so many different fields. And Jeff's always trying to tell me, I'm not that, even though people say that I am, I'm not. And it's what a compliment to be able to say, you know, I'm not really a sociologist, even though I publish papers in sociology all the time. What a treat to come to work every day and to hear him plot his next book project or his next symposium that he wants to do on, you name the topic. I wish I could tell you just some of the ideas that he generates daily. And it's just a treat. You know, when I think of 2012, I don't know if you're asked this question, but I am. What does 2012 look like? And it looks like Jeff Levin, someone who's deeply committed in their faith, but is absolutely at the top of his field. And what an honor and a treat it is to have him here at Baylor University. So I'm going to stop and turn it over to Jeff. I don't want to take any more of his time. My friend and colleague.
Thank you. Thank you, Byron. Well, in the spirit of I'm not, this is a talk on, at a conference on Christian perspectives on healthcare and medical ethics, bioethics. I'm actually not a Jewish bioethicist, so I have to say that up front. By training, I'm a biomedical scientist, specifically an epidemiologist, and I'm also a religious scholar, and I've spent at least 25 years looking at studying the intersection of religiousness and faith and spirituality and healthcare issues as a scientist and as a theoretician. And that includes the last several years focusing on the intersection of Judaism and health. So I guess that qualifies me to, you know, hopefully give a nice overview of this topic at this particular conference. But I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a true rabbinic scholar, and I'm not a bioethicist. So I have to say that. But I am a Jewish scholar of the relation of religion and medicine, so I hope that isn't too confusing. Well, you might notice that the name of this talk is Themes That Should Inform the National Healthcare Discussion. And one might say, given the events in Washington over the last few months, shouldn't the title be Themes That Should Have Informed the National Healthcare Discussion? And yes, I think these are themes that should have informed that discussion. But from my perspective, this discussion has just begun, and it will be ongoing. And I don't say that just and specifically because I think after the new Congress that's to be elected in the next week, and then after they're inaugurated in January, that the existing legislation is going to be repealed and everything's going to be done. Although I think that will partially happen. I'm not saying I'm not saying what I'm saying just because I think that's going to happen, but because these are important issues, and I think that one good thing that's come from this healthcare reform discussion is that these issues are now on the table. The last time these issues really were on the table to this extent was in '93, the so-called Hillary Care debacle, and it was really clear to me, observing at the time, that broader moral themes and bioethical issues were not part of that discussion. So I think there's a chance that they can begin to inform the present discussion, whether the current bill sticks or whether there's new legislation. In either way, I think that coming from the faith community, if I use that word, I'm encouraged that issues regarding bioethics and religious ethics and morality will have something to say about how all this evolves. Well, so what I want to do here this morning, really do 4 things. Just provide kind of a brief summary overview of existing statements regarding medical ethics and health policy within Judaism, among the rabbis or rabbinic community, among academics, Jewish institutions. Just kind of give a brief overview. I'll show some pictures of some books and other resources, and just say, you know, if you're interested more in this, here's where to go. I want to spend a lot of time on that. And then I want to give my own perspectives on some of the themes, on some of the principles and themes and concepts and issues that, from my perspective, should inform or would inform a kind of a Jewish canonical perspective on healthcare, if I could construct that. And talk a little bit about some of the biblical and some of the origins and in my perspective in the Bible and in the Mishnah. And then finally, we'll conclude with a sense of now what? Given these principles that I'm going to discuss, what do we do now? What are some of the challenges we face in implementing this? So starting with some of the health policy statements. Well, I want to start with this quote. Lord Rabbi Emanuel Jacobovitz, of blessed memory, as we say, Zichrono Livracha, he passed away a few years ago, was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, a position that's now held by Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. But interesting about Lord Jacobovitz, he was Lord Jacobovitz, Rabbi Jacobovitz, and he was Dr. Jacobovitz. Interesting figure. He is also considered one of the fathers of the field of bioethics and was one of the preeminent bioethicists in the world, and I think is considered one of the preeminent figures in Jewish bioethics. And he said in his seminal book, Jewish Medical Ethics, Jewish law endorses the unqualified statement that the physician's right to heal is a religious duty and that he who shirks this responsibility is regarded as shedding blood. And he said later, prophylactic hygiene, meaning preventive medicine, is raised to the level of a national legal, a collective institution. And in this perspective, prevention of disease becomes the major preoccupation of Hebrew medicine. So I think what he's getting at is that healthcare, for one, is not a marginal issue in Judaism and in Jewish ethics. And the obligation to prevent suffering and prevent the shedding of blood and to heal is an obligation on people in the healing arts and also on the community as a whole. This is not a tangential issue. In fact, if you go back in Jewish history, some of our greatest sages were also physicians. So the example that comes to mind is the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides, who was both a physician and a philosophical theologian, and wrote about medicine, wrote about theology, and wrote about the intersection. Sephorno, another of the Chazal, of the great Jewish sages, was a physician. Okay, so what's out there? Well, I discovered that my pointer, the battery ran out, and then my wife Lee informed me that if I use a touchpad, it will make an arrow. Well, there we are. So I'll do this in lieu of my laser pointer. These are some of the statements available on healthcare reform and healthcare ethics and public health ethics that have appeared from within the major Jewish movements. Now, we don't really, in Judaism, use the word denomination. We use the word movement or branch, but kind of going from left to right, the Reform movement, see if I can get this arrow to work. The Reform movement had a healthcare initiative, and they have a whole website, and they were very instrumental in this whole discussion. The Reconstructionist movement, which is kind of a leftward offshoot of conservative Judaism, they published a book on this topic and been very involved. The conservative movement, let's see, well, I'll just forget about the arrows. The conservative movement was involved. You can't really see, this was a document that they produced, I think, in 1993. So part of the initial healthcare debate, a document on kind of rabbinic perspectives on healthcare reform. The Rabbinic Council of America is the body of modern centrist Orthodox Jewish rabbis. They've produced statements on this topic, and then Agudath Israel is a more traditional Haredi organization of sometimes disparagingly called ultra-Orthodox, but traditional Orthodox Jewish congregations and rabbis. And so all these groups have produced rabbinic statements or institutional statements regarding issues regarding Jewish morality and ethics in healthcare. So this is across the board. This isn't a little side issue. Other Jewish institutions besides just the movements or denominations themselves have weighed in as well. The Academic Coalition for Jewish Bioethics actually doesn't exist anymore. There's a Society for Jewish Ethics, and this group was effectively absorbed into it as the bioethics branch. But all these various groups, the federations, I'm sure people have heard of the B'nai B'rith, have all issued reports or white papers or statements of one sort or another on this topic. There also have been rabbinic statements, responsa. A responsa is a legal ruling by a member of the clergy, and in Judaism, the word we use is teshuvah, and which actually literally is the word that refers to repentance or return. And so a group of responsa are known as teshuvot. So these are some of the rabbinic teshuvot or responsa by leading poskim. Poskim is the plural for the word posek, which is a rabbinic decisor. So I don't know, maybe an analogy would be like in canon law. And this is kind of a Jewish version of that. So within each of the Jewish movements, there are particular rabbis that are known and accepted as leading poskim. And that means that they issue rulings. And many of them have been compended into books. And so this is Rabbi Feinstein and Tendler and Jacobowitz are leading figures and leading Orthodox poskim. Golinkin and Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's in Los Angeles at American Jewish University, Rabbi Dorff certainly probably the leading conservative Jewish posek, and certainly on health matters. And then this is on the lower left, the Reconstructionist work that came out, Beharef Hayamim, specifically regarding end-of-life issues. And then the rest are by major figures in liberal Judaism or Reform Judaism, Rabbi Freehoff and Jacob and Rabbi Plaut. And then at the end, there are a group of, published throughout the 90s and in the last decade, a group of kind of collected bioethical responses and papers written by my friend Rabbi Richie Edris, who's the leading, I'd say probably the leading bioethical posek within the Reform movement in North America. And actually I have in my office in Pat Neff a whole collection of these little bioethical guides, and they're on all kinds of topics from euthanasia to stem cell research and so on, that collect all the various rabbinic rulings and statements and judgments on this topic. Academics, Jewish academics have weighed in as well. And this is a very hopefully representative but yet small collection of what's out there on the topic. A lot of work by Fred Rosner, who is who's a Orthodox Jewish physician. I think he's at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. He might have been at Mount Sinai, I'm not sure. But one of the leading Orthodox commentators on Jewish bioethics, and also a physician, and he has brought a lot of the work of Maimonides into translation. Lori Zoloff. Zoloff is not a rabbi, I don't believe, but a very well-known Jewish bioethicist that's at Northwestern now, David Bleich. So this is a selection of work. And then finally, this is a very small selection of some of the symposia and conferences that have existed on this topic over the years. What's called bulletin here. This is the bulletin of the Park. Anybody heard of the Park Ridge Center for Health, Faith, and Ethics? Does this ring a bell to anyone? Well, I don't think it exists anymore. This was founded by Martin Marty, the University of Chicago, and it kind of its heyday was in the 80s and 90s. And I think they still exist, but on paper, I'm not sure really what they do anymore. But they've published books and had conferences, and one of the special issues of their journal was on Jewish bioethics and healthcare. There have been conferences. There have been special issues of Conservative Judaism, which is the official journal of the conservative rabbis. There have been special issues of the Reconstructionists, which is the official journal of the Reconstructionist movement. So again, I'm just trying to make the point here that these have been substantial issues. So how would we summarize all of that? How would we summarize all of that? Well, it seems to me in my reading of these various reports and of these books and the conference proceedings and so on, and rabbinic response to Shavuot, they seem to be what I'm able to glean. That as Jews, we have obligations to vulnerable people and populations. We have obligations that as we'll describe later, are covenantal. There's a concern with social justice. Now, how different people define social justice and what's the calculus of that and so on differs, whether we're talking about communitarianism, egalitarianism, distributive justice, whatever. And this has been a healthcare ethics conference. I'm sure there have been all kinds of talks on these different philosophical positions. Well, these debates go on within Jewish bioethics as well, although it's pretty much a uniform sense that we do have obligations and that social justice is a concern. And so the issues of affordability and access come up as well. And also the concept of bechuch nefesh, the preserving human life as an ideal. This is very, very important, as we'll see. This is if you were going to try to find a common ground among these statements by ultra-Orthodox rabbis and Reform rabbis and Reconstructionists and conservatives and academics and the B'nai B'rith and so on. This is my take on what this is. But, there's a big but here. What's missing? Most of the Jewish bioethical literature has been focused on clinical decision-making, discrete clinical issues. Just probably really like Catholic bioethics and Protestant bioethics and Muslim bioethics. So there's a lot of writing, there are a lot of responsa on things like stem cell research and euthanasia and should we pull the plug and what about xenotransplantation and test tube babies and all of this. There's been much less writing, much less in the way of rabbinic responses, rabbinic interpretations of the Bible and the rabbinic and the oral Torah, the Talmud and so on larger public health issues. And so what I've said here, such as, just read this, the nuts and bolts of a putative communal responsibility to provide health care, preventive health care for the community, for the population. And Rabbi Elliot Dorff, the leading conservative figure in this area, it makes this very clear. We do have the clear duty to try to heal. This reminiscent of the slides I showed from Rabbi Jacobovitz at the beginning. We do have a duty to heal, and this duty devolves upon both doctors, healers, and society as a whole. But Jewish sources, and by that meaning rabbinic, theological sources and so forth, sources on what we're to do as far as distributing and paying for health care are understandably sparse. And so, what I hope to do throughout the remainder of the talk is provide kind of a modest, maybe a modest effort to begin a discussion on how we would construct a Jewish response. I mean, just tell you up front, I'm not coming with 18 recommendations on how to fund healthcare or anything like that, but just what some of the major important principles and themes would be, and how Judaism might engage these issues. Well, any time that if I'm gonna present some concepts, all of us see things through a certain lens, and as a Jew, I see the Bible, I see the rabbinic literature through a certain lens. And what's the joke? You got two Jews, you have three opinions. I've heard that said about Catholics. I've heard that said about evangelicals. But anyway, among Jews, it's certainly true. And so I just want to share my own particular lens on this issue, and briefly, and then go into kind of the main text of the talk. Now, the word drash up at the top of the page is related to the word midrash. And it essentially means a sermon. So when you go to synagogue, you go to shul, and the rabbi gives a sermon, what he's given, we call it a drash or a devar Torah, the teaching on the Torah. And since I had to play hooky from shul, from synagogue this morning on a Saturday to give this talk, maybe it's appropriate that we hear a Jewish sermon for a few minutes citing the Bible and the Mishnah. So maybe that's appropriate. So we'll have services here for a few minutes. In Sefer Devarim, which is the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 6, verses 4 and following, is probably the most important part of the Jewish liturgy, and this is the Shema prayer, Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. And then liturgically, we all say, Baruch Shem Kavod Melchuto Le'olam Vayed. Praise be the name of His glorious kingdom or majesty forever and ever. And as Jews, we say this when we wake up in the morning. We say this observant Jews, we say this before we go to sleep at night. And then we go to services at our temple. We say this as well there. Well, the Shema is followed by, or actually it includes, several more paragraphs. The Shema actually is several paragraphs. And the first of these is known as the Ve'ahavta. And the Ve'ahavta paragraph basically is it's almost like an instruction manual about our loving God. And I think for the Christians in the room, you shall love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. To us, that's part of the Shema. We call it the Ve'ahavta. Ahava means love. So Ve'ahavta means and you'll love. You shall love. Well, the V'ahavta, it's interesting. It's kind of, it's like a three-part formula. And so it's telling us, first of all, you shall love the Lord thy God, v'chol lavavka. That's this first line. V'chol lavavka, with all your heart. And then uv'chol nafshaka, with all your soul. And then uv'chol meodecha, with all your might. And the way that the rabbinic sages interpreted this, heart is, with your love God through your feelings, through your affect, through your emotion, through worship, through service to God. Through your soul, kind of they interpreted that as, the rabbis interpreted it as kind of with your mind, intellectually, through using your mind. And then with all your might, meodecha, meaning through your action. So it's a kind of like body, mind, soul thing. So, or mind, emotions, behavior, actions, kind of the three aspects of human psychology. And the rabbis also interpreted by through your actions and through your might also meant through your money. So we work for a living, we get remunerated, and if we give money, if we're charitable or philanthropic, we're actually giving an aspect of our behavior, our work, to a certain cause. So this is a nice kind of biblical statement on loving God, that we are incumbent. You shall. God's telling us that you should do this, and you should do these things in particular. And contact lens alert here. Okay, well, so great. So we're supposed to love God through using our minds and using our hearts and using our actions. Terrific. Now what? Well, we then come to Pirkei Avot. And I'll tell you what Pirkei Avot is. According to Jewish tradition, according to traditional view, when the Lord gave Torah to Moshe, to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave the Torah, didn't just give the Ten Commandments, gave the whole Torah, or the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, but also the belief is gave the entirety of what we call the oral Torah, all the rabbinic commentaries that weren't written down until hundreds of years later. Now that's until the first couple centuries of the Common Era, AD, when the Tanaim, the generations of rabbis, I think Christians know as the Pharisees, began to transcribe all of this and write it down and produce a work called the Mishnah, which is a philosophical legal code. Now the tradition says this was all revealed by God on Sinai and passed down in the oral tradition from Moses to Joshua and so on. This is, it's a nice story. I won't say one thing one way or the other. I think most scholars would say that's not exactly how it happened, but it's Saturday. We'll just say that's what happened. But the point is, and this is on tape. This is great. I'm in trouble now. But the point is, a body of rabbinic writing began to be developed that was essentially, since we no longer had a temple and a priesthood, kind of Judaism version 2.0, the Judaism of synagogues and rabbis had to develop. And in order to develop, we needed a code on how to be a holy people when we were no longer engaging in sacrifices and having a priesthood. And so a body of guidelines developed. And the Mishnah is in translation, it's about this big. And it's essentially a legal code based on the Bible, on the Torah, that includes 63 chapters related to themes of the sacred and the profane, and order and disorder, and space and time, and things like agriculture and so on, and observing the Sabbath. But at any rate, I say all of this in preface. One of the books of the Mishnah is called Avot, which is fathers. And all the various books of the Mishnah, the rabbis then, another generation of the rabbis called the Amoraim, began writing commentaries on the Mishnah, and this is called the Gemara. And the Mishnah plus the Gemara together made the Talmud, which of course we've all heard of the Talmud. And there were two. There was a Talmud in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, and then there was a Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, which most of us who are Jewish are more familiar with. But at any rate, some of these books of the Mishnah have commentaries in one Talmud, and some in the other, and some in both. But for whatever reasons, out of all of the books of the Mishnah, Avot is the only one that there was no Gemara, had no commentaries on. And the Avot is really very unique. It's kind of a book of rabbinic proverbs, of kind of little ethical maxims. And so what was done, eventually, that the Avot itself is only 5 chapters. It's 5 chapters, full of little proverbs. was combined with what's called a baraita, a little extraneous writing whose name is Kinyan Torah, if you're interested, kind of appended onto the back of it. And these 6 chapters together are compended, and it's published in book form as something called Pirkei Avot, which means the verses of the fathers, but it's usually translated as ethics of the fathers. And this is a book that among the religious Jews we read every year beginning with Passover. We just read a little each day. We track through it. And the first verse of Pirkei Avot is kind of tells us what happened after God revealed the Torah to Moses. It was passed down from Moses to Joshua to the judges and blah, 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 all the way to this group of rabbis in the early part of the 2 millennia ago. And then, after that point, it begins with its little ethical precepts. And so the first thing that the first thing in this whole book that it gets to, in verse 2, is something called, we know as Al Shlosha Devarim, upon 3 things, or upon these 3 things. And so what the Pirkei Avot says is Rabbi Simon, said, Al Shlosha Devarim, upon 3 things, Ha'olam Omed, the world stands, like a 3-legged stool. So this is, it chills. This is exciting. It's like, wow, we didn't have to climb up, meditate for 60 years, or go up to a mountaintop to see the guru. This is just telling us right here. The world stands on these 3 things. So what in the world are they? Well, it then tells us the world stands on these 3 things. Al ha-Torah, on Torah, or on learning. Ve'al ha'avodah, upon worship. So we're right there. And Ve'al gemelu chasadim, upon acts of loving kindness. So when you think about it, really what Pirkei Avot is doing right here, it's telling us how to operationalize what the Bible's telling us. So we're supposed to love God, with our intellect, with our mind. We're supposed to love God, supposed to love the Lord with our emotions and our feeling and worship, and then with our might, with our actions. And so Pirkei Avot is now telling us what specifically we're supposed to do. We're supposed to learn Torah. We're supposed to study the sacred text and use our mind. And then we're to translate that into positive affects and feelings and love and service to God. And then wonderful gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness to other people. Well, that's great. It seems like, wow, this is a secret to life. Well, then, a few verses later, in verse 18, the Pirkei Avot again says, Rabbi Shimon says, Al Shlosha Devarim, upon 3 things, Ha'olam Omed, the world stands. This is starting to be confusing. Didn't they just tell us what Rabbi Shimon said? And now they're saying well, it turns out this is a different Rabbi Shimon. And I think historians say this was his grandson, so I'm not sure about that. So this is the grandson of the first Rabbi Shimon, and he's telling us what the 3 things are upon which the world stands, like a 3-legged stool. And they're a completely different set of 3 things. So this is a little unnerving. He said they stand upon Al Hadin, which is one of the Hebrew words for justice, and Ve'al Ha'amet, which is truth, and Ve'al HaShalom, which is peace. So, confronting, well, so which is it? Does the world stand on learning and love of God and worship and good acts, or does it stand on truth and peace and justice? Well, I think it's very clear. You look at this, there's no conflict. What they're telling us is in a way, the Bible's telling us, we're to love God using our mind and our emotions and our actions. And then Pirkei Avot is telling us, the mission of the rabbis are telling us, we do this by learning and by being open to love and worship, and then through good acts, through service. And then it's telling us if we do this, what's going to happen. So really, this is what the result will be. The result will be if we do this, if we love God, if we use our intellects and we learn Torah and study the text, this will lead to truth in the world. If we love God with our heart and through caring for other people and kindness and so on, there will be peace. And then if we do righteous acts and proper behavior and pursue loving acts to our fellow beings, and we'll have justice. So really, this is kind of an instruction manual, and it all fits together. The rabbis also said that of all the commandments, as Jews, of course, we all heard of the 10 Commandments. Actually, for Jews, there are 613 commandments. If you add up all the commandments in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, there's 613. Now, well over 200 of these are kind of moot in the present day because they involve rituals regarding the temple in Israel, which hasn't existed for 2,000 years. But for very Torah-observant, traditional Orthodox Jews, the effort is made to observe the wholeness of all of these. And the rabbi said, of all the mitzvahs, Torah is the greatest of all, the study of Torah and learning the intellect. Now, why? In its own right, certainly not. I mean, we shouldn't be people that just learn and study the Bible and never engage the world. Better, we should not be great Bible scholars, but be loving and kind to other people than, God forbid, be the other way around. But they said that the reason the Torah is the greatest of all is because it leads to all the others. If we're wise and we study the scriptures and study the Bible and the rabbinic writings, then this will lead us to know what to do effectively, to know how to engage the world. And so, kind of to summarize the sermon, what's the idea? We're to love God. Okay, well, that's easy enough. All of us, Jews and Christians, read in the Bible and Deuteronomy, you shall love the Lord thy God. And what the rabbis are telling us, we do this we do this in many ways, but foremost among these ways is through showing it. We're putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak. And finally, our actions matter. This is how, if we do this, we'll have emet, truth, we'll have shalom, peace, and we'll have din, justice. So the question arises, to me, now what? So we're to do all of this, and if we do this, all these marvelous things will happen. So my question is, what are the ideas or the concepts that should be informing our actions? So given that we're supposed to love God with all our might, and we're supposed to do gemilut hasadim, acts of loving kindness, and the Lord's promising, or the rabbis are promising us, that this will lead to din, this will lead to justice. What is this learning? What are these concepts and ideas and principles that should be telling us how to proceed? So in a way, this is my lens on this topic. Again, with the caveat, I'm not a bioethicist. I'm sure the bioethical literature draws on all kinds of other principles and ideas. This as a Jewish layperson, this would be my perspective. So these are the themes we'll step through. So I've selected 10, these are Hebrew words or phrases, of course, 10 concepts that I think should have something to say about any canonically grounded Jewish take on this issue of healthcare reform, specifically in the context of social justice. And so we'll go through all these words. Brit, Kedusha, Tzedek, Chesed, Mipnei Darchei Shalom, Bechuach Nefesh, it's very important, the preserving of life, Halal, Tikkun Olam. Has anyone here heard the phrase Tikkun Olam? We'll talk about that. Teshuvah and Hovel. Hovel is a Hebrew word for jubilee. So this is, again, my lay take on this. We'll step through these one by one. Well, Brit, it's a covenant. This is a word that means covenant. In the Old Yiddish, it's bris. You might have heard of the word bris. When a Jewish boy is born, the circumcision is called a bris. This is simply the Yiddish way of saying Brit, which literally means covenant. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in a lot of his writing, has spoken of a covenantal morality that when we affirm the covenant with God, or I should say the covenants, because there were more than one, we affirmed a set of vertical and horizontal relationships. So relationships, we have obligations to our fellow beings, Jewish and Gentile. We have obligations to God, and God has obligations to us. So these obligations are I just wrote here, bidirectional and mutual. That's just how I put it. The traditional, so this is from the perspective of traditional Judaism. Liberal Judaism might differ on a little of this, that through accepting the yoke of the Torah, through accepting the obligations of that the Bible gives us, and the body of commandments, mitzvot, positive and negative, thou shalt and thou shalt nots, and the collective commentaries of our great rabbinic sages, known as the Chazal is the Hebrew acronym, and the various halacha codes. Halacha is Jewish law derived from the rabbinic writings and from the responses, the contemporary rabbinic writings. Through all of this, as a result of all of this, which continues up to the present day, we have a sense of what we're supposed to do. And as Jews, if we accept that we're Jewish, we don't we don't deny it. We aren't, we don't pretend we aren't Jews, or we aren't self-hating Jews. If we're part of the Jewish people and we take this seriously, all of this information will provide us a sense of how we're supposed to proceed. And so the way I've summed this up, our obligations to God translate into obligations to our fellow human beings. And for people here who might not be familiar, traditional Jews, when we write the word God or Lord, sometimes we put a little hyphen in, because now by background, I'm a Reformed Jew going to a conservative synagogue. I don't necessarily, the idea here is that out of respect to God and the sanctity, the kedusha of His name, we don't write out the word God, or we don't write out the word Lord. That's not necessarily my perspective, but in public I like to do this. And also I know among many Orthodox Jews there's some concern about throwing away a piece of paper that has the word God written on it, or in this case, if I ever delete this file, the word God will go away. So if this were a Jewish conference, I wouldn't have to explain this. But some people often ask me when I'm...
Thank you for saying that, because that's
Yeah, so sometimes if you actually read books by Orthodox Jewish rabbis, or see something in an Orthodox newspaper, you'll see G-D, or sometimes G exclamation point, and this is kind of an aside, and in very traditional synagogues, not something you necessarily would find in Waco, but even instead of saying the word Lord or saying Adonai, people would say Hashem, which just means the name. So it's kind of a holy way to say God's name. And we wouldn't say Eloheinu, we'd say Elokeinu. So at any rate, this is just, for this audience, I thought I would explain that. So at any rate, the idea being that we have obligations to God, and these obligations translate into obligations to our fellow humans. So that's one thing. Another concept, kedusha. This is a word that means holiness. And there are a variety of words in Hebrew that come from this word, like Kaddish, which is the Aramaic prayer we say. Actually, it's a prayer we say in the service. It praises God's name, but most people are familiar with it. Most Jews are familiar with it. This is a prayer we say in memory of someone's passing. Or Kiddush, which is basically after services, if people go to synagogue, then you have some drinks and some food and dessert. This is known as a Kiddush. Right? So lots of, and more words than that, but lots of words come from kedusha. So essentially, Judaism teaches that our mission statement, if you will, as Jews, is to bring holiness to the world. And the great mystics, the Hasids and the great Jewish mystics and Kabbalists, sure we've all heard of the Kabbalah, talked about that the phrase they used was redeeming the sparks. And this is kind of a charming metaphor that when God created the universe, everything that was created essentially were sparks off of this one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. And off of this one came all these little sparks. And it's our job to kind of unlock the innate holiness, to bring back to, how to even language this, bring back to remembrance. And each spark is every little being or thing or material or anything that in existence, physical or non-physical or material, immaterial. So every time we do a good deed, every time we do something good, or we help somebody, or we work for justice, or we're merciful or loving, or if we're an academic and we're in a particular field and we do something wonderful in that field, that we've helped to redeem that particular spark. So this is kind of a mystical take on this. And like I said, we do this by striving to follow the path of the commandments and act in accordance with moral and ethical principles and so on. And Jews believe that every person is a reflection of God's own kedusha, God's holiness. And so that's why we are to act lovingly and justly toward them, because they and us are, in a way, we're one. We're all, we say in our liturgy, the Lord God, the Lord is one, Adonai Echad, and God was one, and everything that was created, again, it's hard, dealing with language here is difficult. Everything came out of this one, and we're part of that, and other people are part of that, and so we have an obligation to deal justly and kindly. So the way I've summed it up, respecting the needs of others honors their innate holiness and reverences the Lord. Okay. Another concept, tzedek, justice. This is related to the word tzedakah. And one of the ways that people might have heard the word tzedakah, or Jews might have heard the word tzedakah, in traditional Jewish homes, we keep what's called a pushki. And this is a Yiddish word. This is like a little box. And Lee and I have a pushki. And, Friday night before we go to synagogue, I drop a 10 or 20 or whatever, drop some money in there. And at the end of the year, got a nice pack of money. And we lived in Kansas for years. We give some of it to the mission and some of it to the Goodwill. Or, it's just kind of and certainly we give to Jewish causes as well. Saying that for the sake of the video. Give to all causes, but keep a pushki. And not the Yiddish word being pushki, but most people know it as a tzedakah box. And what's interesting is most people, probably most modern American Jews, think of tzedakah as a word that means charity. And it does, but it literally means justice, which to me, in and of itself, is, I think a very interesting meditation all by itself. That the word we use for charity really means justice. And there are other words in Hebrew that mean justice as well, and other phrases, redifat tzedek v'shalom, pursuit of justice and peace. You see this in the rabbinic writings. I think we're familiar with the passage in Deuteronomy, justice, justice shall you pursue that you may live. And there's some rabbinic commentaries. Why did God have the word twice in there? And it's just to emphasize that it's so important. So we're obliged to ensure that people who aren't as advantaged as us don't suffer as a result of a lack of something that's essential to their well-being. And I should say this doesn't, when it comes to healthcare, as we'll talk about, this doesn't necessarily imply any particular political agenda, whether, federal control or volunteer sector or anything like that. But this is making it, this means that for Jews there's an obligation simply to act out of justice. Now, how one calculates that, that's a different question. But I don't think any Jewish rabbi or Jewish scholar would deny that we have an obligation to act in this way. As said, this is kind of a complementary concept to tzedek. This means mercy. And sometimes it's translated as love or loving kindness. But it literally means mercy. And it's the root of the phrase gemelu chasadim, which was one of the phrases we found earlier. The great sages and the mystics explain that and there's a tremendous amount of mystical writing on this as well, that justice must be balanced by mercy and mercy by justice. That if we're too much of one, if we're too just and by the law and by the letter and by the book, we end up being severe and we can be unmerciful to people. On the other hand, if we're only merciful, completely only merciful and loving without any kind of justice. I mean, think of this in the context of parenting. The great Russian sociologist Petrom Sorokin wrote a lot about this, wrote about love, altruistic love that was too much of one or the other. You can really mess your kids. Think of the concept of your kids. You can mess your kids up if you're only just and only severe and don't have any mercy. But if you're only, that's okay, and don't set boundaries, then problems happen. So at any rate, in the larger ethical context, the balance of tzedek and hesed was very important. And again, Deuteronomy tells us we're to love the stranger in your midst because you were a stranger once. So the idea is we should be merciful to people that are less fortunate because we've been in their shoes. So we need to act out of compassion. Another theme, mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of peace. And this is a phrase that appears throughout the Talmud and the Midrash, which are the rabbinic commentaries. Everything that's written in the Torah was written for the sake of peace. This is from a Midrash called Tanhuma. And what's important here is that the rabbinic sages would say that our actions for the sake of peace would take precedence over any ideology. That there's a time and a place when our ideology, and this kind of, whether we're conservative or Tea Party or progressive or socialist or libertarian or Democrat, whatever, that ultimately we need to keep our eye on the prize. And that whatever the calculus is that we determine will respond to this problem, we need to be acting for the sake of peace. And this also says that there's a place for compromise, as long as we aren't, it's not compromise that's destructive to people. So for the sake of peace, now I've summarized it, we're to forego focusing solely on ourselves, on our immediate welfare, on our, on being, we should focus less on having to be right than on intending to doing what's right. And this is hard for us. And it's this week especially, leading up to the elections, there's just, I can't even watch the TV. There's just so much, and all sides, just yelling and anger, and I think that, Jewish tradition would just find it all apart, a pox on all your houses. So this is another very, very important concept, pikuach nefesh, to save a life. And for a Jewish tradition, saving a life supersedes all the other mitzvahs, except 3. And this is an important concept. As I said, as Jews, we have 613 commandments. We really have less than that because we don't have a temple right now. But they're all kind of situational except for 3. I mean, we are not to murder an innocent person. We aren't to commit adultery or sexual immorality, and we aren't to worship idols. But other than that, like the examples I give, I'm Jewish, if I'm stranded out in the desert and I'm starving and I'm about to die and a pig runs by, it's supper time. And to not, definitely, it's not an option. I must, because I need to preserve my life. If I knew a Lubavitch rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi, one of these guys with the black hat and the payasses and everything, and very, very devout. And some members of the community saw him driving his car on Shabbat on Saturday to the hospital and said, what in the world's going on? Well, his wife was about to deliver, so of course he had to drive his wife to the hospital. Don't be silly. Another example in a Christian context, of course, in World War II, a lot of families, of course, there was a great tradition in Holland, Dutch families that hid Jews in their basement, hid them from the Nazis. Well, the Nazis would come to the door and say, do you have any Jews here? Well, thankfully, I say, no, we don't. I mean, they lied. Now, we shouldn't lie, but in order to preserve a life, some things are more important. So the idea being that for Judaism, saving a life, preventing the shedding of blood, supersedes anything. So that's a very important principle. We see it there in Leviticus. Don't stand by idly when the blood of your neighbor shed. And it's a guiding principle for Jewish bioethics. So when a life's on the line, really little, I won't say nothing else matters, but little else matters, and certainly not one's politics or one's financial well-being or one's ritual piety. Another one, kalal, peoplehood. And this is kind of interesting. As Jews, we see ourselves as part of a community, as a people, not as a kind of a collection of individual, separate, disconnected individuals that are linked by a social contract. So this is a very different view of peoplehood or citizenship, for example, than the 19th century utopians. This isn't a Rousseauian kind of perspective. And this communal perspective for us governs our identity, who we are. We see ourselves as a people. How we think about redemption and salvation. I've run into many people who think, oh, so you Jews, you believe not in salvation by grace, but salvation by works. Well, no, the concepts don't even exist. For us, redemption is something that all of us do as God's agents here in the world. Redemption is a concept that refers to our mission in the world. The idea of individual souls needing to work out some type of something with Hashem, with the Lord, is not really true to the Jewish understanding of this concept. And then our obligations to others. These are communal, these are collective. So the point I'm making here is this idea of peoplehood, of community, of kalal, is implicit in how we think of ourselves and who we are and how we relate to God and what we're supposed to do and so on. And so a main task for us is to work together to help fix things, to repair the world, heal the sick, and so on. We're God's agents. And the phrase that is used often is tikkun olam. And this means literally to fix the world, to repair the world. And it's often used in the context of healing. This is I should just say, to the point of information, this is a very popular concept among progressives and liberals. I don't mean Jewish liberals. I don't mean liberal Jews. I mean Jewish liberals, people who are politically to the left part of the spectrum. For example, anybody heard of Rabbi Michael Lerner, the magazine Tikkun? This is a prominent kind of Jewish socialist political magazine. Michael Lerner is a conservative rabbi. So it's very confusing, these words liberal and conservative in Jewish context. But Tikkun Olam, Tikkun is the name of his magazine. But at any rate, the idea here is that the presence of the poor or needy amongst us is a sign of kind of the brokenness of the world and our failure as Jews to take seriously God's charge to devote ourselves to justice. So that's what we're about. A couple more of these concepts. Teshuvah, repentance. Well, the word also means return, as in turning back from transgression and aligning ourselves with moral and ethical precepts. And the word is halacha. Halacha is a word that references kind of the body of quote-unquote Jewish law. So for Orthodox Jews, the codes of Jewish law, like the Shulchan Aruch, are guides to how we're supposed to go about our life. And to Reform Jews, this really doesn't come into play. We kind of are free to operate through our own conscience. And then conservative Jews, something in the middle, yes, we're bound to Jewish law, we're bound to halacha, but we have to make sense of it, interpret it in light of how we're living in the modern world. And as I mentioned, a legal decision based on Jewish law also is known as a teshuvah. So to me, my sense is that in all of this, that this ongoing healthcare crisis that's been in the news, I think the medieval rabbis would maybe see this as a crisis in our moral commitment and perhaps as a marker of our apostasy. And that's pretty serious. But the fact that this problem exists, it continues to exist, and we haven't done enough to help resolve it, is a sign of our own, put in a Christian context, our own faithlessness, if you will. And how we address this speaks to how we recognize I wrote here, our pressing need to return to obedience to God. Well, the very last concept, and then we'll come to the last section of the talk, is Hovel, or Jubilee. And we're all familiar with the Jubilee year, that after every 7 years we let the fields lie for a year, and we do this, and then after the seventh cycle of 7 years is over, then we're in this Jubilee year. And I mean, ideally, I don't know that this is a practice today, but property is returned to the original owner and so forth. But the idea, I think, theologically, halakhically means an obligation to restore things to their original order. So everything's is God's. It's all, on loan to us for a season. And after a time, it must be restored to him. And to me, this is evocative of several of the themes that we've talked about here. The idea that there is a gold standard of morality, that we have covenantal obligations to the poor. We need to pursue justice, that there's this communal dimension of our personhood. So the way I've summarized this, if some folks' needs aren't being met through no fault of their own, God requires us a kind of, I put quotes around this, sort of redistributive justice that's much more thorough than any secular government could dare legislate. And what I mean by this, whether our own political perspective is pro-federal government or control of this issue, as in the current administration, or more amenable to the private sector or the philanthropic sector, no matter. Whatever perspective, Jewish teaching, Judaism would tell us that we have an obligation to act. We can't simply walk away. And whether it's a government program that's going to tax us and then redistribute wealth to other people for their health care, or it's ourselves voluntarily setting up mediating structures to do this. That's something to be worked out in the policy sector, but as Jews, we are nonetheless obligated. We can't just say, that's not my problem. Okay, so the last thing, given all of this, so what do you do about it? So here are all these wonderful concepts from the Bible and from the Rabbinic sages. What do we do about it? How do we go for it? Well, this is from Sefer Breshit, the book of Genesis. When Lord said to Abraham, he was still Abraham then, go forth, lech lecha, go forth from your land and your father's house to the land I'll show you. I'll make you a great nation. At the end, Abraham went forth as the Lord commanded him. So the Lord said, go forth, and Abraham went forth. So essentially, Abraham was sealing his writ, his covenant with God, by going forth. He became an actor in the world. He became an agent of God's intentions for humankind, and that's our charge too. And so everything that I'm saying here, this isn't just an academic exercise. I mean, it is an academic exercise, but it's not just that. Ideally, these ideas should inform us in going forth and doing things. So if we choose to go forth, what are some of the challenges we'll face? Because we'll face them. What are the barriers that we'll encounter? And I am, I'm not coming necessarily bearing a lot of answers here, but, like a good professor, I'm coming bearing a lot of questions and a lot of challenges, and I'm not just doing that for heuristic purposes. I don't know that I have the answers, but I'm full of questions. And with each passing week or month, I'm full of more questions. And as I've sat down, I've actually read all the various healthcare bills that were proposed. And, I have even more questions after reading all of that. So these are kind of some of the issues that would arise from striving to live out a commitment to Jewish teachings. So the first thing, policy challenges, okay? So couching this in conventional bioethical terms, Beecham, I'm sure if anybody hears of bioethics, we're already Beecham, how do we meet our obligations for justice and beneficence and without violating, people's autonomy and violating the principle of non-maleficency. So if people read Beecham and biomedical ethics, this is kind of, bioethics 101. And so how do we do these first two without, screwing up the second two? That's a problem. And not just in the individual patient care context that so much of biomedical ethics is written in, but in the larger population context. So the idea here is how do we elevate access for vulnerable people or underserved population without threatening access for everybody else? Because the rabbis will tell us we need to attend to this, but not to put yourself at risk. The rabbi spoke of limits to charity. And this is something that is distinctively Jewish, and I think is very much not necessarily consonant, certainly with Catholic tradition. And I can't really speak to evangelical tradition, but there are limits to charity. We are obliged, we tithe and so on, and we give philanthropically, we're generous, we give to charity and so on. We attend to these issues, but the point at which we've given so much that we then render our own house, our own family in need of this charity, we've gone too far. So how do we strike this balance? How do we foster social justice for some without then, as a result, sacrificing it for somebody else that's out of favor? How do we provide care for the less advantaged without creating entitlements that put everyone else or put the whole country at risk? This is a challenge. And again, as I say here, these are challenges in the policy realm that obviously, from my saying all this, present some very clear economic challenges. So what are some of these? These raise all kinds of issues regarding a command economy, like we're clearly are in the process of setting up, versus kind of my own. Just give honest disclosure. I'm not an economist in any way. I just stayed at a Holiday Inn Express or whatever that commercial is. But I was influenced very much in the 1980s by the Austrian school economists, so Mises and Hayek and Hazlitt, and that's very much outside the mainstream. So I'm just putting that out there. That's my perspective on the issue, kind of 19th century classical liberalism. But that critique of the kind of direction we're moving in focuses on when we abrogate, and I'm not an economist, we abrogate the discovery process when we don't allow the market to kind of set prices and reach it, water to seek its own level. We simply impose a structure that we run the risk of, not necessarily run the risk of creating some inefficiencies and shortages, and rationing perhaps is inevitable, and we create a kind of most favored status for political allies of the party in power. And in this context, it could mean state-sanctioned refusal of care for groups who are out of favor. Now, God willing, this is not anybody's intention right now. My perspective on this is, and this goes back to what I was saying about kind of the discourse right now. I would never question the motives of this administration like some have done. I give them the benefit of the doubt. I think that when you read the legislation especially, the motives are very earnest, very well-meaning. I'm just not sure that they've been translated into viable strategies and that they won't create more problems along the lines that I've discussed. That's not, again, I'm not an economist. That's not a political statement. I've actually read H.R. 30. Well, I've read through H.R. 3590, which was the House-Senate reconciliation, and it's about 900 or 1,000 pages. And I just want to say my concerns on this issue are not primarily ideological. They're not, oh, I'm a follower of Austrian economics, so I hate this because Obama's a liberal or socialist. That's absolutely not at all. I'm just not sure that that's been set up will be able to achieve these justice and mercy and access and affordability and so on without potentially creating shortages in rationing and efficiency and putting us at risk, creating a situation where we're at risk. But I think the rabbis would say that in the end, just we need to come up with something that delivers on its promises. That's important. Doesn't matter what party puts it forward, what we call it, what words we use. And so that's kind of the bottom line. We'll just do what it says it'll do. And so I'm a little skeptical. I'm not one of these, this is a calamity, it's going to ruin the country, it's a terrible bill, we need to repeal it. I suspect from my talks with people on the Hill that some aspect of this is probably going to get redone, but the idea that it's all going to be wiped away, I'm not thinking it's going to happen. But again, that's a different talk. That's not a Jewish rabbinic bioethics talk. I can't bear it because it's just people yelling at each other, and I just can't bear it, and demonizing each other instead of trying to work together. And I'll say something about the current Congress. Passed legislation while refusing to read its own legislation. That's been documented. The White House doesn't appear willing to negotiate. There's been kind of a blackout on some of the other proposals. I don't know if people here realize I counted at least 7 other healthcare proposals that were put forth. Kirk, Dent, Ryan, Coburn, Shadig, Gingrey, a bunch. Kirk put forth 2. And really hear about those. And there was no sense to bring both sides onto the table to negotiate this. And I think this was unfortunate. And I will say, decision-making on this issue seemed to be, the words I use here, on non-political calculus on both sides. So here, sounds like I'm being negative about legislation that was passed. I'm very dismayed by the Republican response to this issue. I think it's just, for the most part, just been no. And I read a document from one of the DC think tanks, I won't mention it, that was kind of a response to the legislation. And it was like a little one-page flyer, and it listed out the major points of the current response to the healthcare crisis. And the gist of it was, that's no good, that's no good, that's good. What are you going to do about it? I mean, it's easy to take pot shots. Come up with something better. And again, there were some bills put forth, but they never made it out of committee, and not that I'm aware of. At any rate, I think that on both sides of this issue, shouting has, there's been more shouting than there's been, as I said here, careful policy deliberation, attention to economic realities, and efforting to ground this in some sort of a ethical tradition. And my impression is that the situation is not going to change much next week. I think it's possible the players will reverse roles. So we'll have one side that's in charge and is being intransigent and not willing to negotiate. And in fact, I would be shocked if this isn't the case. And so maybe I'm pessimistic, but that's my take. So we had policy challenges to produce economic challenges, to produce political challenges, and then back to morality and ethics, these produce moral challenges. And this is just kind of a Jewish consensus on all of this. Do moral values and principles influence health policy? Do they? Yes. I mean, whether they do explicitly or whether they do because we've ignored them and we have some kind of baseline presumptions that are never articulated that inform what we do, yes. Our principles ultimately influence policies. Should they? I would say yes. Are we obliged to work for constructive change? Yes. According to only certain ideological perspectives? I think Jewish tradition would say no. As long as whatever will get the job done. It doesn't matter if it's according to democratic socialism, according to libertarianism, or compassionate conservatism. If it works, it works. And we need to find the things that work that get done what we need to get done. Are we in breach of our covenant obligations if we eschew this responsibility? Yes, most definitely. And should concern for justice and mercy and saving life and preserving peace and so on take precedence over political calculation? On both sides of the issue, absolutely yes, 10 million % yes. There's a wonderful, I mentioned Pirkei Avot as kind of this collection of rabbinic maxims. one of them attributed to Rabbi Tarfon, one of the sages. So Rabbi Tarfon would also say, and this is, some of us might have heard of this phrase in different translations, it's not incumbent upon you to finish the task, but neither are you free to absolve yourself from it. And this is a guiding principle for Jewish people that are concerned about engaging issues of social justice and tikkun olam. This is this pasuk, this verse of Mishnah is tacked up on a lot of bulletin boards and in a lot of offices and a lot of Jewish agencies and rabbinic seminaries and so on. Well, so we're coming to the end now. So we have some take-home points. And this is kind of how I would sum this up. Regardless of any of our political or economic preferences or our level of ritual observance or anything, and I would say this about the Jews or Christians or anybody else, the rabbis, the sages, would be near unanimous in support of an obligation to provide for the health care of people that are unable to afford it or provide it on their own. Absolutely. Again, regardless of how we end up doing that, the obligation unequivocally is there. And I put here, this is a I think in my original slides that was supposed to actually be red. But this is a red letter issue. You know, like the red letter Bible. This is for Judaism. This is a red letter issue for rabbinic Judaism. Because this mitzvah, this commandment of preserving life, pekuach nefesh, is paramount. It's so vitally important. And I also would say, it's hard. So here I've outed myself as, with having this lay interest in the Austrian school economic theory. Having said that, it's hard for me as a Jew to imagine any organized Jewish entity, whether a rabbinic entity or a communal entity or a religious entity, that would sanction a purely laissez-faire or a social Darwinist or a Randian, meaning Ayn Rand, objectivist libertarian approach or something similar to this issue of healthcare. It's inconceivable to me that there would be any kind of Jewish response from the right, my arms right, from the right or to the left, whether politically or economically or religiously, halakhically, that would take this type of a radical, just leave it to the market. I actually can't fathom. I'm trying to think of all the people I know, and I can't fathom anybody that would support this. And such a view might even be considered a halal Hashem. This is halal Hashem is a phrase that literally means a desecration of the Lord's name. I think that it would be considered a halal Hashem in some matters to take that kind of arch, kind of ultra-right perspective on this issue. I just can't imagine it. So the kind of the anarcho-libertarian or minimal state, Nozikian kind of ethics, at least when it comes to healthcare. I'm not talking about the nature of government and so on, but when it comes to healthcare, because of the issue of preserving life and shedding blood, I think would have probably close to zero traction among observant Jews. This is regardless of Democrat, Republican, Orthodox, secular, whatever. Now maybe someone will come along and tell me I'm wrong, and they know Rabbi whatever that says I'm wrong. But I certainly think 99% of organized Judaism across the spectrum would say that the kind of 100% free market libertarian kind of classical liberal economic perspective on this issue. It's just is not only is untenable, but would be immoral. So I'm saying that as someone who's wildly conservative himself, but that's my read on this. Well, I want to close with a wonderful comment by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, my friend who's the former rector of the Rabbinic School, American Jewish University, leading figure in conservative Judaism in the United States. And I think this is nice because it kind of sums up some of the points that I've made. The Jewish demand that everyone have access to health care does not necessarily mandate a particular form of delivery, such as socialized medicine, or not. Any delivery system that does the job will meet these Jewish standards. So the proofs, if it works, including socialized medicine. However, the fact that more than 40 million Americans have no health insurance whatsoever is, from a Jewish point of view, from a Jewish rabbinic point of view, an intolerable dereliction of society's moral duty. And then he concludes, while the specific form of healthcare system may vary, the healthcare system that one is promoting or suggesting may vary, Jewish ethics definitely demands that American Jews work to ensure the United States as a society provides health care to everyone in some way. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. A few questions.
If there- anybody, yeah, go ahead.
I could say this in any conference I've been to. This is not specific about this one, but I've been in trouble for years about the equivocation between health care and health insurance.
Yeah.
You know, like right here, you know, health care, health insurance, used almost interchangeably. Yet I regarded them as very, very separate terms. And so, I mean, I hear you on the skepticism, you know, we're probably against Democrats, like that. But I have to say, I'm frankly skeptical that we're going to get really anything good as long as we don't distinguish. I mean, when philosophers don't distinguish between what, they'll do what they're supposed to do in making distinctions. You know, I have health insurance. I've had my car insurance. I live in 4 different states, same insurance company. Health insurance, I carry it with me wherever I go. But, I mean, car insurance, life insurance, excuse me. My health insurance, you know, I can't buy it across state lines, all these various things, and just, there's just so many issues that are not even identified. So I'm skeptical, not of necessarily of the political parties so much as just that none of us are really grappling with real issues.
I'll speak to that, because this came up in '93 with the bill that the White House put forth, the one that kind of crashed and burned. Really, you know, there's been all this talk about healthcare reform. Really, what it's been has been reform of medical care insurance. I won't even use the word health. It's about who's going to pay for medical care. It's not really been much about health care. I think preventive health care has been 1%. Also, I should say that I'm a public health person. I'm not a physician. I'm a public health person. And I've heard many times this issue described as a public health bill or whatever. This has nothing to do with public health. Public health is a field that has to do with epidemiologists and environmental hygiene. It has nothing to do with public health. Yet I hear congressmen, I hear senators in both parties talking about this as our way to address public health. It addresses zero of public health. And I don't see much of it addressing health care, meaning community health centers, primary care, so on. I don't see much of it really addressing the quality of medical care, the issuance of medical care. It's just basically who's going to pay the bill for the provision of medical care and what will the decisions be made as far as who gets care. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I agree. I think to tie this at least back into what I've spoken about, I think as you've seen, you know, in going through these concepts from the Rabbinic canon, from the Bible, there's not much guidance as far as, you know, healthcare insurance. This was not on the radar back then, but simply that there was a moral obligation to enable people to receive care. It's interesting that in the present environment, this has devolved into a discussion of who's going to pay for people going to the doctors. You know, there's other types of healthcare. Yes, in the back.
My question was very much related to your comments. I'm a nurse and I'm very much into health promotion and illness prevention, and I love that about the Lord Rabbi's statement about preventive medicine.
Yeah.
So my question is there discussion among Jewish groups about more emphasis on preventive medicine, maybe finding a political candidate that talks about prevention?
Not that I've heard of. I mean, I think it's one of these things that in this whole debate is given lip service. It's kind of like we need to do all that, and including preventive medicine, maybe my wife will know is the budget of the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which funds federal funding, most of the funding for medical research. Is it like less than 1% of the budget goes to basic and applied research on preventive medicine, and primary prevention of disease in people and population.
CDC gets most of it.
CD, the Centers for Disease Control, naturally, which is a public health entity based in Atlanta. Of course, they're mainly epidemiologists, but NIH itself is not doing, for the most part, preventive research or funding research. So, I can't think of a major rabbinic figure that's made a soapbox out of this. I will say that some of the books I showed earlier by Rabbi Dorff and others, are very adamant that we need to attend to prevention of disease. But It's usually just that. They're saying, we need to attend to this. The rabbi said to, it's the scripture says to, we need to do it. But are there concerted colloquium of people devising a national Jewish medical strategy on preventive? No, I mean, is there a Christian? There are church-based health promotion programs. Some of the denominations, like the General Baptist State Convention in North Carolina, the Black Missionary Baptists had some large-scale statewide health promotion programs in churches that as a graduate student back in the early 80s in North Carolina, I was involved in. It's a lot of fun, but I mean, is there a national faith-based discussion on this issue ongoing? If there is, actually, Byron, there is. I haven't heard about it, other than it's just always a line or two in some of these larger discussions. So yeah, as a public health person, I'm nervous about that. I hear all this stuff about healthcare and healthcare reform and all this, and nobody's talking about preventing disease. Nobody's really talking about the public health infrastructure in this country, which I think is very damaged. This is an issue that's very important to me, and I'm starting to write about in a policy sense. There actually was considerable improvement in the last administration, helping state health departments, local health departments, giving them resources, connecting them with each other, but we're still woeful. We really are not set up. Yet all this focus on, and all this energy and all this angst and all this stuff about who's going to pay for, whose medical care and so on. And that angst is deserved. I mean, we need to focus on these issues. But I know as a public health person, what's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if you're a nurse, anybody who's out there on the front line, so to speak, or people who are like in community nursing, we know this. Vaccinations. And I'm on a local group in Waco. There's an immunization committee. We meet once a month. And there's whole segments of the community that are dramatically under-immunized. And it doesn't matter how much education is thrown at them and how much other stuff. We just aren't reaching these folks. And as a result, a generation of kids are going to grow up at risk for serious diseases. This is a public health, so any of this discussion of financing medical care and all this, is there any part of that pot of money that's going to be going to projects like this? I didn't see anything like that in the bill. Yes, sir.
I was intrigued by the covenantal language that you were using early on in your discussion of the roots of a Jewishly informed approach to ethics. And of course that reminds me of the Hippocratic tradition,
Yeah.
the vertical relationship with the Greek gods and this ritual formal covenant. And in particular how it does not dwell on autonomy as much as it does on community. And so I see perhaps some connections there that would be fun to build on. I was wondering what you thought about.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, and I think I tried to explain it in the kind of the Jewish sense of personhood is very communal, collective. I mean, certainly we believe that we're people and individuals, and we have individual rights and so on. But as far as a sense of our mission and our in this world, we work communally, we work collectively, and so. I mean, that's an interesting question. So Jewish bioethics tend to emphasize autonomy less than the other major 3 or 4 concepts, for example, that Beecham talked about. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's probably possible. I think it's possible that that's gotten less attention. In some ways not. This is I don't know if this is an interesting example or not, but abortion, of course, is I'm not talking about a public health issue, I'm talking about a clinical issue. Abortion, of course, is a very serious issue. It divides a lot of people in this country. The Jewish perspective on this is the religious Jewish observant classical rabbinic perspective. I'm not talking about secular Jewish or liberal Jewish, but is that I think the Jewish tradition it would be even more ardently, quote unquote, pro-life than the most ardent Roman Catholic or conservative evangelical or fundamentalist Christian. So that even the abortion in the case of rape or incest, that's not sure if they would even go for that. But when it comes to legislation prohibiting abortion, even in the 3rd trimester, even the so-called partial birth abortion, even the most devout, seriously devout, ultra-Orthodox rabbis would likely be opposed, because according to halacha, according to the rabbi's interpretation of halacha, until the baby literally is born, if it is a threat to the mother's life, and that's been, the doctor has acknowledged that, and the Orthodox rabbis acknowledged that, the baby must be aborted. It's not like it's permissible. It's a must. To not do so, you're risking shedding the blood and harming the existing life. So so in some ways, traditional Rabbinic Judaism is much more conservative on the abortion issue, even than the most conservative Christians. But on this one issue, when I talk to people, they hardly can believe that, even partial birth abortion. But if the mother's life, notice, some rabbis have expanded that, include the mother's serious threat to physical health. But recognizing that's a slippery slope. But notice we didn't say mental well-being, psychological wellness, quality of life. It's the life. If the life is threatened, the pregnancy must be terminated. And this is, again, these are not secular or reform or humanistic rabbis saying these. These are ultra-Orthodox rabbis. So this seems to me a profound attention to the autonomy, at least to the mother. Doesn't say much as far as the fetus, but in Jewish law, until the baby's born, it's considered, and this is hard to explain, it's considered I think the literal translation is like an intruder, but that's harsh, but it's, the mother's life takes precedence because the mother is a living being, and if if it can be conclusively said that life is threatened, then the pregnancy must be terminated. So this is a very off the beaten track issue, but I think there are some issues clearly where at least in this case, the autonomy of the pregnant mother is respected. Whether this translates into public health issues, I don't know. I mean, that sounds like a great topic for a paper or a book or a presentation. I'll ask Elliot, the next time I see Elliot Dorff, which will be January, I'll ask him. I'll ask him about that.
You want to take David's?
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually have a question that relates to the economics of healthcare and the ethical implications of the way that works. And it comes from having a close friend who chaired a panel for the Royal Society of Canada about 15 years ago on some of these issues in terms of, just how can you make, we have a more socialized form of medicine up there, and people like to think of it as doing a good job, but in fact we're being crippled right now by the cost. But back there 15 years ago, Paul Hagen, who was a conservative, like yourself, conservative Jew, chaired this panel, and what they discovered, amongst other things, in terms of the information that came in, that 40% of the health costs in Canada were attributable to lawyers, insurance companies' fees, and it was just a guess at what they regarded as the excess charges made by drug companies. Now, you know something about what the Canadian government has done about the drug companies, but it's much worse down here, in my humble layman's opinion. That is to say, it's a more litigious society, right? Tort laws are such that, it's a real big problem. I have physicians who are friends, they have enormous annual costs for insurance.
Right.
And I look at the drug companies, which aren't restricted, and I think, well, we have a big ethical problem here. And here's what my question is, right? My question is, as somebody who's clearly driven by an ethical concern from a Jewish perspective, what have Jewish thinkers said about how shall I put it, the rapacious culture, if I can put it, if that's not too strong, of the medical industry itself and the allies that they have in the legal guild and so on? Because it seems to me that the problem of delivering health care to everybody, right, I probably sound like a Maoist by now, but a huge part of that problem is somehow locatable, right, in the kind of nexus I described.
Well, from my perspective, that's absolutely true. I think most people can observe that. I'm sure rabbis have spoken out against it. I mean, in the context of the healthcare reform debate of the last couple of years, I can't put my finger on any rabbinic response that addressed this issue vociferously. I think any rabbinic posek, any decisive that I know would agree with you. I have to say that I'm always a little nervous about I mean, I'm in favor of tort reform within limits. I come from a line of attorneys, and my dad was a lawyer, and I have friends that are lawyers, and whenever I am too vociferous myself about things like tort reform, I always hear the other side of the issue. And so, I want to kind of be sensitive, but I would put it this way. There are all kinds of economic, I don't say extraneous, but economic factors that have created the mess that we're in that are external to simply the costs involved in healthcare and medical care professionals delivering care, this kind of dyadic relationship. There's all sorts of other things going on that have created an enormous cost burden and that have effectively bankrupted the system and are bankrupting the country. And I wouldn't put that all on malpractice insurance and lawsuits, but yeah, it's absolutely the case. I think what the rabbis would say, by this I mean the medieval rabbis, the sages, was that got to keep your eye on the prize, keep your eye on what matters. And if these extraneous things that are threatening the ability to attend to the needs of individual people, got to go. I mean, we have to undo it or change it. And if this causes wailing and gnashing of teeth among certain sectors of the economy or certain individuals or certain professions or ambulance chasers or whatever, so be it. I think they would be very clear about that. They'd be sympathetic. We don't want to put their families in danger. They have to make a living too. But clearly, you can't look at this issue and just think that the problem is that doctors' and nurses' salaries are too high or something, and that's created this problem. It obviously has not created this problem.
Join me in thanking Jeff.